Welcome to History 1302. This is the second half of U.S. history. This is taking place after Reconstruction, after the Civil War is over with, and going to the modern time, modern era. The period after the Civil War, after Reconstruction is going to be referred to as the Gilded Age. And the Gilded Age will go all the way until the end of the century. This comes from a book written by Mark Twain and Charles Dudley Warner called The Gilded Age, which was published in 1873. And essentially, when you gild something, if you gild a chair, for instance, it will often look like it's gold. And so if you didn't know better, you would think, oh, this is a very expensive piece of furniture because it's solid gold. But if you scratch the gild, if you scratch that surface, underneath you might find lead or some other, or wood, some other metal that would make this piece pretty worthless. Well, that's kind of what Twain and Warner were saying about society in the United States during this era, that on the surface it appeared to be glittering, it appeared to be booming, everything looked really great, but if you scratched just underneath the surface, then there were a lot of problems that weren't really being addressed and that are going to increase as the century moves along. This is an exciting time. It's a time when the country is trying to really recover from the horror of the Civil War. You have industrialization developing. The cities in the north are growing larger and more powerful. You're having immigration increasing as these decades of the century pass, but that immigration is going to lead to issues in those cities where you're going to have overcrowding, disease, poor sanitation, and other problems. You're going to have technology really increasing during this era. This is the time period when railroads become incredibly powerful. The Transcontinental Railroad will be completed in May of 1869. This is going to unite the East Coast with the West Coast. It will aid in the development of the Western territories and the Western states. You're going to have a lot of new towns being created and people moving west. It will be pretty much the downfall for the Native American tribes, who are going to see the buffalo almost extinguished as they are killed to feed these men who are building the Transcontinental Railroad. You will also have hunters that will come just to shoot the buffalo for sport, and this was the major food source for the tribes. And so they're going to have starvation beginning to develop, and they're going to be increasing problems between these tribes and the military as the tribes fight against the onslaught of Western settlement moving into territories that they had always occupied. They really didn't know what to do other than to fight back. You're going to have wars that take place. They're going to be a pretty good one between the Sioux and the U.S. military. That's going to finally result in a peace treaty. That's going to be short-lived when gold is discovered in the territory that the Sioux had been awarded. This is when George Armstrong Custer, is going to come onto the scene, and you will ultimately have the Battle of the Little Bighorn, where he is going to be killed. And by this time, too, with the buffalo kind of going away, you're going to have, this is going to be the era of the cattle trails. All those famous cattle movies and Western movies that you've seen with the cowboys, this is going to be their time period. Even though that really only covered about a 20-year period, the movies make it act like it, or seem like it was a lot longer than that time. You're going to have corruption that will take place with those railroads. The Credit Mobilier scandal is going to be a particularly well-known one. This is going to involve railroad stock and almost like insider trading, which is going to be part of the construction of the Transcontinental Railroad. You're going to have a panic, an economic depression that will happen in 1873, and then Custer will be killed in 1876 during the time that we're actually celebrating the 100th anniversary of this country. And when we really thought that we had gone into a modern period, we're still having issues with Native Americans and fighting on this continent that we had claimed. So there was still some work to be done as far as the military and the government was felt. As I mentioned, this was the time period of the rise of the cattle industry, and you're going to have the cattle trails where cattle will be herded from Texas to railheads because they could get a lot more money for them. This is after the Civil War, and this is going to be one of the things that will turn around the economy for Texas. And you're going to have all those cow towns, cowboys coming in. This is going to be the rise in the time period of outlaws. A lot of these men had fought in the war, and when they came out of the war, they just really couldn't settle back down to living as farmers and doing that kind of thing. One of the most famous is going to be Jesse James with his brother Frank. And in 1866, 18-year-old Jesse planned a bank robbery for Liberty, Missouri. And in February of that year, Frank James led a group of about a dozen men in the first recorded daylight bank robbery. Jesse didn't participate in that actual robbery, but it was a success. They left with $60,000. And over the next couple of years, the James brothers became the suspects in several bank robberies throughout western Missouri. But the locals were sympathetic to them and vouched for the brothers. And the detective novels of that time, the dime novels, made the James brothers and other outlaws kind of into folk heroes, kind of mythical Robin Hoods, and brought them, and like Billy the Kid and other men like that, a lot of fame during this era. In 1873, the James gang entered the field of train robbery, and they suffered a major setback in 1876 when they raided the town of Northfield, Minnesota. After spending a few quiet years farming, Jesse organized a new gang. That's not going to go particularly well. He is going to enlist two brothers, Charlie and Robert Ford, and they were on the fringe of the gang and disliked Jesse. And on April 3rd, 1882, Robert Ford comes to Jesse's house, and when Jesse turns his back on him, he actually is going to shoot and kill him in the back. Billy the Kid is another famous outlaw from this time period. He's going to be out further west. Again, he is going to be killed by Pat Garrett. There was some consideration of pardoning Billy for his crimes, but the governor of New Mexico opted not to do that. This was in 2010, is the last time that's kind of come up. Probably the most famous gunfight in the West took place on October 26, 1881 at the OK Corral in Tombstone, Arizona. This is going to be between with the Earp brothers, Virgil, Wyatt, and Morgan, and their friend Doc Holliday. And then on the other side, you're going to have Frank and Billy Claiborne. You're going to have the McLaurys that are also going to be on that side, and Billy Clanton. And the Earps are going to come out on top of this. And ultimately, the West was a place populated by a wide variety of people, homesteaders, the military, Native Americans, and a group of men and some women who made their living on the wrong side of the law. Now, in terms of politics, we've come to the period of the end of Reconstruction. The Compromise of 1877 brought that about. Rutherford B. Hayes had become the new president. He is not popular with his own party, which is the Republicans. They are split between two political factions, the Stalwarts and the Half-Breeds, led respectively by Senator Roscoe Conkling of New York and James G. Blaine of Maine. The difference between the two factions was somewhat murky. The Stalwarts generally supported Ulysses S. Grant, a radical Southern policy, and the spoils system. Half-breeds took an opposite view on the first two issues and were vaguely touched by the idea of civil service reform. Hayes made some vague attempts at civil service reform, but did not get too far. On economic issues, he was very conservative and accomplished little. Now, after him, you're going to have James Garfield become president with Chester Arthur for vice president. Garfield was a member of the Half-Breeds, Arthur a member of the Stalwarts, so that was a good compromise on the part of the Republican Party. This is a close election. He is running Garfield is running against a man named Hancock, who was pretty popular, but he still comes out as the winner. On July 2nd, 1881, Garfield started on a vacation in New England to get away from office seekers. As the president passed through the Baltimore and Potomac station, Charles Guiteau, described for many years as a deranged office seeker, shot him in the back. "I'm a stalwart," Guiteau explained. "Arthur is now President of the United States." Garfield lingered on for 2 months before dying on September 19th. And at this point, I'm going to stop, and then when I come back, I will continue on with Garfield.